She's writing for the online organisation called Huffington Post, or HuffPost they're called. Let me read out to you a key line of what she said in a recent article. She said, "We all have something in common. We are all trying to figure out who we are and accept that version of ourselves." She wrote an online article about being a Chinese American woman. She wrote it after a fellow Chinese student said to her, well, I don't know if it's a fellow Chinese, but a Chinese student said to her, "You are the worst kind of Chinese." And it's because she was an American Chinese. She had been born in America and raised with Chinese parents, but deeply saturated in American culture. And this fellow student that she was trying to care for when she was studying said, "You are the worst kind of Chinese." And it sent her kind of into a tailspin. And so she wrote this post about it, which then had a huge response, a huge online response, and from people who experienced that in America, who had that same kind of problem of their parents' goals and desires for them were maybe oriented in much more in their kind of historical cultural group, and feeling wanting to be American because you lived in America, but then all the tension that created. And she talked about the way her parents prioritized education and learning Chinese and knowing a musical instrument. Perhaps some people can relate, which she pushed back and she hated because it made her feel more Chinese and she wanted to be more American. But now she looks back and wishes that she had listened to her parents more. Anyway, it kind of got this huge online response. So then she wrote, one of the things that led to is that she deleted all her social media accounts, because all these people who didn't know her were then kind of commenting on who she was and talking about her appearance and what she looked like, and she was getting offers from various men to make her feel loved. Just let the reader understand. So she deleted her social media accounts, and then this is where the second quote comes from, because then she realized, actually, who am I? Because without my social media accounts, people don't know who I am. And is that who I am? And here's the quote again. "We all have something in common. We are trying to figure out who we are and accept that version of ourselves." But just listen to that statement for a second. See, the great thing that unites every human being is, the thing that we all have in common is, we are trying to work out who we are. That's a pretty low bar, don't you think? The thing that unites us as humanity is we don't know who we are. See, I put it to you, she's right. It's why our sense of self is so fragile these days. We don't know who we are, and we don't know who we are supposed to be. Now, some of us feel like we've worked that out, but many of us have not. And I want to put it to you that actually the reason in the West, Western society, that our society has gotten to this point where our sense of personhood is so fragile is because we've lost actually a sense of the sacred. We've lost a sense of the sacred, or even more, we've cut off the possibility of the idea of God. We assert again and again, there is no God, that's one option, or I like to think of God as the spaghetti monster. I don't know if you saw that 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. God was made fun of the spaghetti monster. And so what are we left with? Well, we're left with us. And we've kind of got to this point where we've said, well, our history doesn't matter because we're looking back on history and said, well, historically people did so much wrong, and I'm not sure I want to be connected with that historic group of the West and the way it's oppressed others. Or I'm not sure I want to be connected to my Chinese culture because I'm now American. Or I'm not sure I want to be Australian in the way that other people have been Australian. And so what are we left with? We're left with us. We, humanity, are the high point of reality. Now that's really exciting, right? We get to define what is good and true and right. Human beings are, if there's no God, the high point of existence. We are what is great. You are what is great. You are what is supreme. There is nothing greater than you. Does that excite you or fill you with a little bit of dread? Because at the same time as we define our individual self-existence, we live in a society that has reduced us to being consumers and commodities. We live in a society where there is the pornification of everything, where bodies are used just for pleasure. We live in a society that has welcomed death to get rid of problems. And the image that keeps coming back to me, and I've used this before in the past, is that like we've created this box called humanity, or perhaps even narrower, individual human beings. And it's this wonderful, magnificent box. It's the high point of creation or reality, because there is no creation. But when you open the box up, it's empty. There's nothing of value there. And the interesting tension is that actually without God, it's kind of right. It's kind of right. If you've cut off the idea that there's a God, or the possibility of the God, or the possibility of the sacred, it's true. Catherine and I are halfway through the film on, I think it's on Disney, called Nomadland. And there's this scene where the key character is out looking at the stars in the sky, and she's listening to an astronomer or someone speaking, and he says, "Now look at your hands. You are made of stars." And it's beautiful, right? Because the atoms that are in our bodies were once part of an exploding star. But think about that for more than 7 seconds. Well, but so is the earth, and so are the trees, and the worms, and the cockroaches. They also were made of stars. So again, can you see how we're just kind of flattened, we're leveled. At one level, we're magnificent, but we're exactly the same as everything else. Mere cosmic dust at best. And so we're this magnificent box, but when you open it, it's utterly empty. And if you let go of the idea, if you say absolutely, positively, there is no creator, that's what you have to keep coming back to. So we actually need to recover for the sense of our human identity, for the sense of valuing human beings, for the sense of what it means to live in this world as not just individuals but humanity. We need to recover who God is. And not the God of our imaginations, not the God we'd like to think of, but the God who is there, the God who makes himself known, the God who is self-defining and gives us definition. Here's where we're going. We're going to look at those 4 points. The God who is Lord, the God who is holy, the God who is present, the God who saves, and the God who is personal, the Lord. Pick it up with me in Exodus chapter 3. Moses is out shepherding. This is a little bit, I can't remember if it's the first Die Hard film where, the great hero of Die Hard, Bruce Willis, he's a wreck. He's basically a wreck. It's not quite that bad for Moses. He's got a family. But, being a shepherd is kind of the low-paying, unwanted job. And he's off shepherding in the wilderness. He thought he was the prince of Egypt, but it was a failed dream. He thought that he could rescue God's people, but it all came to nothing. And now he's off being a shepherd on the far side of the Mount of Horeb. Pick it up with verse 1. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father. There's not even his own flock, for crying out loud. The priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness, and he came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, boom, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Now Moses saw, though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. There's this little interesting phrase, it's not quite there in the NIV, but it says that Moses turns aside. He's on this path of being a shepherd, and then God comes into his life and turns it aside. And one of the big things that it's setting up, it's not really developed fully, but I want to kind of explore it a little bit with us here because it will come again and again throughout the book of Exodus, is that with the bush, there's these hints of this thing. The bush is on fire, do you notice? But it doesn't burn up. It's on fire, but it doesn't burn up. Why? Well, because the angel of the Lord is there. Later on, it just says the Lord speaks. So there's this direct connection. The angel of the Lord, there's no kind of gap between the angel of the Lord and the Lord. And you see that throughout the Old Testament, whenever the angel of the Lord appears. It's God speaking, it's God at work. And so here's this idea, actually, it's hinted at, of transcendence. God doesn't require power from this world. This flame can be there and it doesn't burn up the bush. It's not dependent on this creation or this order in the way that we are. And that's what intrigues Moses. He's seen plenty of fires. He's like, how can there be, the question is sharp, how can there be a bush that's on fire that actually is not burnt? Perhaps there's no smoke. And so he's going, the timber's not consumed. And so he comes to see what's going on. And notice the next thing we learn here, in little glimpses again. When the Lord saw that Moses had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, said Moses. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid of God. Moses does exactly the right thing when he hides his face, really. Exodus 33, we're going to hear later, God says to Moses, you cannot see my face, for no one may see my face and live. Why? Because God is holy. What does that mean? Well, it means, the word strictly means kind of distinct or different or separate. And whenever it's used in the Bible of holy things, they're things that are set apart for God. So what does that mean? Well, three things when you look across the Bible. Holiness is God's incredible different being. His being is different. God is spirit. He's radically separate from us. He's creator, not creature. That's the first part of holiness. The second part is his ethical character. God is brilliant in his pure hatred of evil and his love of justice and goodness. It's his being, it's his character, but God's holiness is also shown in his saving mercy. And this is all just being set up for us because it's what we're going to see in the rest of the story of Exodus. We're going to see God's holiness. How? In the punishment that comes through the plagues. The plagues are the punishment for injustice and mistreatment. We're going to see the holiness of God when the oppression of Egypt is overthrown and the slaves are set free and justice is done. We're going to see the holiness of God when the weapons of injustice are broken and destroyed. The army and the chariots are swept away. We're going to see the holiness of God when the Egyptians are plundered, their wealth built on slavery, and that wealth is taken away and given to others. God, the God who is holy, transcendent. But notice the tension here. Moses is both summoned and warned not to come near. Why is that? Because we can't come to God on our own terms. If God is holy and transcendent, or since God is holy and transcendent, greater than us in power and greater than us in holiness, put those two things together. God's great power as the creator, in which his holiness is immersed together with it. There's no separation in his character. Our theologians call this God's simplicity. What they mean is, unlike us, that where we sometimes are inconsistent in our character and our actions, God's simplicity is that everything is perfectly united in God. So his holiness, his hatred of evil, his love of justice, and his love and his power are perfectly presented in him. So can Moses approach him? Absolutely not. And yet, Moses does approach him. Why? God said to him, take off your sandals. God makes a way for this ex-prince of Egypt, this smelly shepherd, to stand in his presence. The God who is holy. But there's more. Don't worry, we'll get faster as we go. The God who is present. The God who is present. Look with me at verses 7 to 10. Just listen to the verbs, the doing words here, and look how they're attached to God. The Lord said, indeed, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land. And verse 9, now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. You notice all that powerful language? It's the God who is present. It's the God who is present. It's this word, imminent. Imminent means to be here. It means to be present. It means to be right on the spot. God is imminent. He's here. Sometimes we use it to mean it's coming. Something is imminent. It's about to happen. But actually we're saying that because it's pressing upon us, that reality. Notice what it says. God has observed. God has seen. God has heard. God knows. God has come. God will rescue. See, God's holiness means that what happens to us, what happens to God's people, matters to God. And so the picture here is holding two things together. God's transcendence, did we look at that a second ago? God transcends His greatness, His power, His supremacy, and God's immanence. The picture of God is both those things, that God is greater than we can imagine, more powerful, more holy. Now, many people have that picture of God, and God seems far off and distant and unapproachable. But actually, God is also present. The transcendent God is also the present God. The holy God is also the saving God. We need to hold, if we have a true picture of God, we need to hold those two things. Because if we kind of go, God is great and powerful and transcendent, and that's all we hold on to, the question becomes, does God care? Why would God care? The answer is, well, He wouldn't. But if we hold the picture that God is just kind of present, God is just, Joan Osborne, and then also sung by Alanis Morissette, what if God is one of us, just a slob like one of us, catching the bus like one of us? That God is present, that He's just like us, He's just kind of, then He has no power. What can He do to change things? He's just one of us. Well, that's hopeless. Why would you put your trust and power in that kind of God? Don't. But actually, the Bible's picture, the God who reveals Himself, is both those things together. Transcendent and holy, present and saving. That's who God is. Two quick implications from that. If God is both transcendent and present, if you're a Christian, oh boy, should you pray. Because how much power does God have? All power in the universe. Therefore, you can ask Him to do things, to change things, to be at work. But He's also the God who is present. He cares, He hears, He knows. Boy, oh boy, should you pray. God sees, God hears, God knows, God rescues. If you're a believer, we must pray for our city, for our communities, for our friends, for our families, for ourselves, for Risen Church. Another application, just briefly, justice. See, there's a warning here. Why does injustice arise? Because we think no one sees, no one cares, no one knows, and no one has any power to do anything. That's what the powerful think. Think, no one's going to see this. And if they do see, no one knows what's really happening, and no one cares, and no one has the power to bring me to justice. Well, a warning if your heart is set on injustice. God sees. God knows. God cares. He is powerful and transcendent. He's not like us. He's not among us in the way that we are among each other, but he is also present. He's powerfully present. But if we sat there, that would be something to wrestle with still. But there's another thing revealed in Exodus 3. God is the saving God, the God who saves. Pick it up with me in verse 10. God says to Moses from the bush, "So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." We'll just sit there for a second about this for a moment. A single man against a superpower. I'm not sure if you were Moses how you would have felt about that. You know, wearing your sandals, what we would consider a dress. I mean, he's not even really girded for battle, right? He's probably got a staff and a drinking flask. And God says, by the way, Moses, you are going to go up against Pharaoh and you're going to bring a nation out of Egypt. And when you consider that, then Moses' response is exactly right. Verse 11, but Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Now, if Moses was talking to us, what would we say to him? "Oh, come on, Moses, you've got charm. You're good looking. You're skilled in the ways of leading sheep. That's not that different from leading a nation. And you were a prince of Egypt. And look what God's already done for you." But that's not God's response. God says to Moses, "Yep, actually, I know you're inadequate. I know you've got issues. But I don't." Verse 12, and God said, "I will be with you." That's it. There it is. That's why this mighty, world-transforming salvation is going to happen. Because God says, "I'm going to make it happen. And I'll be with you to make it happen." It is inevitable. It's going to happen. And Moses has to trust. And we talked about this on Tuesday night in the gospel community. God says, "And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." So actually, the sign that it is me is actually when you're worshipping me on the mountain and you see who I truly am, then you'll know it's I. So Moses has to trust. God says, "I will be with you. Trust me, I've got this." We're going to come back to that at the end. One more thing about the Lord who is God. Notice who God is. The God who is personal. The God who is Lord. Verse 13. And Moses said to God, "Well, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What's his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." Now that doesn't seem like much. Verse 15, God said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever." It doesn't seem like much, but there's a lot going on here. See, God gives his personal name in verse 15. The Lord is actually the word Yahweh. So when you see the Lord in capital letters, which most English Bibles do, they put the Lord in capital, when it's in capital letters, it's actually the word Yahweh. That's God's personal name. Like Glenn. I won't put my name in there, but say to the Israelites, Catherine, the God of your father. That's how, it sounds weird to say that, I'm sorry, but it's trying to help you see how personal. God is saying, this is who I am, this is my name. Yahweh. Now, what happened, why is it written the Lord, is the Jews were afraid of blasphemy, so they used they used to pronounce the word Lord or Master whenever they saw the word Yahweh. So Yahweh, the letters, the consonants were kept in the Hebrew Bible, but they would say the word Lord rather than saying Yahweh because they were afraid of blaspheming against God. That's how much they reverenced his name. And so the consonants were the words Yahweh, but then the vowels underneath were the vowels for Adonai, and that's how you get the word Jehovah, which is a mistake in the old Bibles. But yeah, God's personal name is Yahweh. Talk to me about it, but I just want to explain where Jehovah comes from. It comes from the consonants and the vowels all being mixed up. But notice who God says is. My name is Yahweh. I am the God of your fathers. He's introducing himself. He's binding himself to his people. And let's explore this little interesting phrase, I am who I am. It's the verb to be. It's the verb of existence. You could read it like this, I am who I am. Or you could read it, I will be who I will be. Or you could read it, I have been who I have been. All of those are the fact that God is self-defining. I am who I am. I am the creator. I am the one who exists. I'm the one who existed before existence. I am eternal. Nothing else defines me. Nothing else determines who I am. Nothing else shapes me. I am who I am. Now we grapple with this because none of us is who we are. All of us are shaped by our culture or by our family or by our upbringing or by our friends, and some of those things all mushed in together. None of us is self-defining, but God is absolutely free because he's absolutely self-defined. Except, because he's absolutely self-defined, remember I talked about God's simplicity before, he's self-defined though by his character. God will never do anything inconsistent with his character. He always acts in perfect consistency with his character, which is why God will be who he will be. Because of his perfect character, he's always going to act exactly who he is. And because of his perfect character, he's always been who he has been. And he always is who he is. You know, we sometimes say to each other, maybe parents say this more to their children when they make a mistake, that's not like you. Can you hear that? We're saying there's a gap between the actions of the person and what we thought their character was like. Or, I really thought I knew him. And I've discovered that I didn't when he ate the last Kit Kat out of the fridge. I thought I was loved and cherished, but I've discovered that I'm not. See, but God is always who he is. And he defines himself in perfect freedom, unlike you and I. Now, why does that matter? Well, why does that matter? Here's this incredible idea. The God who defines himself in perfect freedom, who's transcendent, who's creator, who wields all power in perfect holiness. Look at verse 15. Say to the Israelites, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This God binds himself to people. He binds himself in personal commitment to individuals. Perhaps if you've been Christian for a while or you've heard a lot about Jesus, that seems like, of course that's what God does. But no, it's not of course. Through the history of the world, that's never what gods have been understood to do. If you read Homer, you'll see that the picture of the Greek and Roman gods is they are incredibly fickle. During the Trojan War, if you ever kind of read that, the gods are constantly changing who they barrack for. Or take something like Hinduism. There is no personal God. Every soul is a little flicker of flame that needs to return to the true great flame. Every person has a drop of water in them that must be dissolved in the ocean. There's all these gods in Hinduism, but ultimately there's no ultimate personal God by which you'll have relationship and connection and character. But here it is. God, He's still the God of Abraham, even though Abraham is more than 400 years dead. He's still the God of Isaac, and He's still the God of Jacob. Now, suddenly the whole book of Genesis is brought into picture here, because what were they like? Well, they were fickle, inconstant. Some of them were deceptive, some of them were stupid, some of them were sly. But God was still their God, because He bound Him, not because of their greatness, but actually because He bound Himself to them. And because God binds Himself to people, it shows how much they matter. They are of infinite value to God. See, listen to God's heart at the end of verse 16. I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt and into the land, a land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The God who is Lord commits Himself to people out of His holiness, out of His love, out of His power, out of His majesty. So think about that, coming to the conclusion. Think for a moment about God's transcendence. He's greater than all creation. Our earth could fit into the sun 1.3 million times. And there are 1 billion trillion suns in the universe. Pause and think for a moment about the power that God has and His greatness. And that is matched by His holiness. It's His holiness that will lead to the plagues on Egypt and the rescue of His people. It's His holiness that means He sees, He hears, He knows, and He cares. How can we come into His presence? How can we be with Him? Well, because He first commits Himself to us. See, it's the God who says, I'll be with you. I will be with you. See, He's saying, I am the God of Matt. I am the God of Glenn. I am the God of Oren. I am the God of Liam and Georgie and Ethan. But how can this be? How is it possible? Well, it's possible because God makes a way. See, what does He say to Moses? Moses, you are standing on holy ground. Take off your shoes. That's what God does. He's greater than we can imagine. And yet He wants us to be in relationship with Him. He says, I am your God. I will be with you. And then He opens a way up for that to happen. And that way, we know, ultimately, is Jesus. That's God's great pattern. He creates the sacrificial system in Leviticus so that God's people can be with Him. He rescues them. He tells them what it means to be with Him throughout the prophets. But then finally, you think of something like what we read in Hebrews 10 or 1 Peter 3:18. It says, God gave His Lord Jesus, He died for sin once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. So that God could say, I will be with you. Where should you rest your human identity? Where should you find your significance? Where is a stable place to ground yourself that will never let you down? It's the fact that your Creator wants to know you, wants to be with you. And in Jesus, if you're a Christian, has bound himself to you. There is no greater significance than that. That is the most significant thing about you. But what about if you're not a believer? What about if you're not a Christian? Well, the Bible says God longs for you to have that same significance, and that he has opened the way up through the Lord Jesus Christ. The question is, will you come to him to find your identity? Or will you look elsewhere to fragile and fleeting modes of identity that in the end will fail you? What I'm going to do is lead us in prayer, but then open up for questions or comments. Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, we thank you that you are the great